Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the mysterious world of Vincent Gigante, the cunning boss of the Genovese family, known as the Oddfather for wandering the streets of New York in a bathrobe, hiding his power behind a mask of madness. Yet beneath that quiet facade was one of the sharpest criminal minds of his time, ruling an empire from the shadows. As you close your eyes, imagine the whispers of strategy, deception, and the quiet control he held over the underworld. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always love seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, be sure to subscribe and join our family. Now, settle in and let the night draw you deeper into silence. Vincent Louis Gigante was born on the 29th of March 1928 in Manhattan to Italian immigrants who carried Naples in their accents and work in their hands. His father repaired clocks and watches, a patient craft that demanded steady fingers and an ear for tiny sounds. His mother sewed, stitching long hours to help feed a house full of children. The family settled in Greenwich Village, a maze of short streets where laundry lines crossed courtyards and the smell of sauce drifted through summer air. In that neighborhood, reputations traveled faster than taxis. You learned early who kept order, who could protect you, and what happened to people who didn't keep their word. Vincent grew up among brothers who took different paths. One would one day become a priest and a voice in city politics, proof that the family's roots touched both faith and public service. At home, discipline was real, money was tight, and the city itself became a teacher. He was quick with his hands, sturdy and quiet. Fists found purpose in a boxing gym long before any courtroom ever called his name. Inside ring ropes, he learned distance, timing, and how to appear calm while calculating. He fought as a light heavyweight in the mid-1940 seconds, still barely out of boyhood, stepping into smoky venues where the crowd demanded grit more than finesse. He put together a strong record, more wins than losses, enough power to keep opponents honest. Trainers liked his focus. He didn't waste movement. He didn't talk much. The lessons of the ring would last. Keep a tight guard, never telegraph intent. Look ordinary while waiting for your opening. Boxing also introduced him to men who arranged more than fights. One of the figures around him, Tommy Eboli, managed fighters and also moved in circles where disputes were settled outside bright lights. Around gyms and social clubs, the line between sports and the street could blur. On sidewalks near Sullivan Street and Thompson Street, in cafeterias where coffee came thick and strong. The village crew linked to the Genovese organization kept a close eye on young men who showed discipline and loyalty. Vincent, a good earner prospect with a reliable temperament, fit that mold. He didn't brag about who he knew or what he was willing to do. That discretion counted for more than bravado. By the early 1950 seconds, as the boxing slowed, another path opened. He became a driver and bodyguard around powerful figures, including Vito Genovese, who had returned from exile and was reasserting influence in New York's underworld. Being a chauffeur to such a man didn't just mean opening doors and minding schedules. It meant presence in rooms where decisions shaped rackets across the city. You listened more than you spoke. You learned who owed what, which business paid, which unions were pliable, and how to run gambling and loans without drawing unnecessary heat. The crew operating from Greenwich Village, overseen by seasoned lieutenants, collected from gambling parlors, extended credit at high interest, and encouraged deals that left little room for argument. In that world, respect and fear traveled together, and Vincent earned both. The nickname Chin came from home, a family shortening of an Italian diminutive for Vincenzo. In the neighborhood, a nickname signaled closeness. On the street, it became a calling card backed by a growing reputation. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room. He didn't need to be. People paid attention because they understood who stood behind him. Then came the spring of 1957, a year that reshaped the American underworld. Frank Costello, long recognized by many as a major boss, faced pressure from rivals. Tension simmered. On a May evening, a shot was fired in the lobby of Costello's building. The bullet grazed Costello's head, sending him to the hospital but not to a grave. Newspapers exploded with headlines. Police moved quickly, and prosecutors charged Vincent Gigante with the shooting. In court, Costello took the stand. He admitted fear, but when asked to identify the gunman, he could not or would not do it. The jury acquitted Gigante. Even so, the attempt rattled Costello enough that he stepped back from power. Public accounts and later testimony by various witnesses in other cases would often point to Vincent as the triggerman. The law, at that time, did not secure a conviction. That distinction, what prosecutors alleged, what insiders whispered, and what a jury actually decided would follow him for decades. The same year, the country got a rare, accidental look at the breadth of the national organization when dozens of members were discovered at a meeting in Appalachian, New York. Raids, arrests, and investigations followed. The old belief that these crews were just local toughs fell apart. They were structured. They had hierarchies, territories, and rules. In that climate, anyone connected to a major family learned a sharper version of caution. Vincent kept a low profile. He leaned into quiet authority, moving through trusted social clubs and keeping daily routines steady. The village became his base, familiar corners, loyal faces, businesses that knew not to ask questions. Authorities believed he had a hand in the sort of rackets that kept cash flowing: illegal gambling, loan sharking, shakedowns that prized predictability more than drama. When business owners fell behind, they were reminded of debts. When gamblers couldn't pay, they were encouraged to reassess their habits. Unions mattered too. Control of a union local could mean influence over contracts, deliveries, and hiring. Investigators would later trace the ways such influence produced steady income streams. While specific allegations surfaced over the years through informants and surveillance, the strongest legal shifts came later. During this earlier period, day-to-day enforcement largely relied on intimidation without leaving vivid scenes that would threaten broader public outrage. It was a business model tuned to avoid headlines. In 1959, federal authorities brought a narcotics conspiracy case that included Vincent among the defendants. Court records from that era reflect a conviction on that charge. He was sentenced and served time in federal custody during the early 1960 seconds. The details of that case were part of a larger Justice Department push against leaders and associates of the Genovese organization. For a man who had built his work on being careful, the conviction was a blow. Prison, however, didn't end careers in that world. Sometimes it hardened status. Doing time and keeping quiet, refusing to cooperate, could elevate a man's standing. When he returned to the city, he rejoined a network that valued loyalty proven under pressure. If you want to understand how he kept advancing, consider the traits that made him useful. He treated secrecy as a craft. He communicated in short, vague phrases. He preferred face-to-face talks in places where microphones wouldn't easily hide. He trusted only a narrow circle for sensitive matters. The lesson from the Costello case: charges might not stick if evidence stayed thin, reinforced a core habit. Don't leave a clean trail. Investigators grew frustrated. They could sense his reach, hear informants refer to him with respect and fear, and yet actual proof often remained just beyond the line that makes a case. That frustration added to his legend. But legends, especially in New York, are built on routine as much as drama. Vincent kept to the village's rhythm. Mornings in cafes, afternoons on stoops, evenings in back rooms with card games and conversations that never quite said the dangerous parts out loud. People in the neighborhood saw him. He wasn't a myth to them. He was the man whose presence could quiet a dispute without raising a voice. He didn't have to pound the table. A look sufficed. He knew the fathers, the sons, the shopkeepers, the priests. He gave out small favors and expected bigger ones in return. That exchange helped now. Loyalty later formed the threads he used to weave influence that stretched from street corners to boardrooms. The 1960 seconds brought changes in New York: new buildings, new politics, newsreels filled with protests, and also deepened law enforcement focus on organized crime. Federal prosecutors used wiretaps more aggressively. Grand juries pulled in witnesses and offered immunity to pry open tight lips. Still, many around Vincent treated subpoenas as noise and silence as survival. He continued to be associated by investigators with classic rackets, gambling operations that ran quietly behind legitimate storefronts, high-interest lending that trapped borrowers, protection payments that bought peace. When disputes escalated, the public rarely saw the fallout. That was part of the method. Discourage spectacle, settle issues where there were no cameras, and keep the city at arm's length from the true machinery of the enterprise. Even as the pressure built, family life continued. Vincent married young and, over the years, maintained a complex personal world that included children he loved and tried to shield from his professional life. He also kept a long-term relationship outside his marriage, an arrangement that remained a matter of gossip in certain circles and fodder for later newspaper stories after his arrest decades later. Those who saw him at home described a man who could be gentle, almost courtly, with relatives. At the table, he was attentive. On the street, he was cautious. He compartmentalized. That separation became essential later, when questions of mental fitness and family testimony entered the legal battles that would define the final phase of his life. As the 1,960 seconds closed, the Genovese organization adjusted to leadership shifts. Old figures passed on or went to prison. Younger, hungry men moved up, and some veterans, including Vincent, began to shape crews of their own. According to investigators and later court filings, he rose from soldier to capo, supervising men who ran bookmaking, Shylock loans, and labor racketeering. He selected lieutenants who could handle collections, smooth relations with other families, and keep their lines tight. He prized discretion over flash. In a decade when some rivals sought notoriety, he chose invisibility until invisibility itself became his most famous disguise. You can see, even in these earlier years, how two tracks formed. On one track, courtrooms and headlines documented arrests, indictments, and the occasional conviction. The Costello case with its sensational testimony and acquittal, the narcotics case with prison time, that strengthened his underworld credibility. On the other track, daily life in the village revealed a steady, confident hand-weaving influence through loans, games, and union leverage. Those two tracks would collide in the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds when federal RICO tools matured, when prosecutors assembled broader conspiracies, and when a man known for calm invisibility began walking the streets in a bathrobe while mumbling prayers. To understand whether that was illness, theater, or both, you first need to recognize the planner behind the mask. The boxer who learned patience, the driver who learned proximity to power, and the organizer who understood that the most effective threat is the one you never have to speak out loud. He didn't start as a ghost. He became one carefully, deliberately using the city's noise to hide his quiet. Those who watched him in the village during these years saw a local fixture. Those who investigated him saw a rising figure in a structure that prized continuity, revenue, and silence. Those two pictures are not contradictions. Together, they sketch the foundation of a man who would later be called the most powerful boss of his era, even as he pretended not to understand the simplest questions. Before the bathrobe walks, before psychiatrists and judges argued over sanity, before headlines tried to pin a label on him, there was a boy in a tight apartment, a teenager with gloves on his hands, and a young man who learned how to move through a room without leaving fingerprints on the air. By the early 1,970 seconds, the village had changed, but his rhythm hadn't. He returned from federal time with a quiet air that said nothing and meant everything. The same corners knew him, the same cafes held his seat, and the same men measured their words in his presence. He didn't rush. He let others talk first and watched how they handled pressure. Around Sullivan Street, a clubhouse with worn chairs and a stubborn coffee urn became a hub. The phone almost never rang inside because calls were handled elsewhere. Notes didn't exist. Conversations happened face to face, often during short walks that gave him time to study body language and to let the wind swallow sentences. That habit, keep it personal, keep it vague, wasn't flair. It was policy. The West Side rackets that fed the Genovese organization were steady rather than flashy. Gambling rooms moved quietly. Credit at steep rates brought in weekly envelopes. Disputes over loans rarely reached police. Freight, construction, and certain union locals offered leverage without noise. If you could nudge a contract, steer a delivery, influence which company got a job, the money flowed with far less risk than street stick-ups. Investigators who tracked these businesses later mapped the pattern. Fixed bids, kickbacks, and the unspoken promise that paying the right people meant your project stayed on schedule. Behind it, in the view of law enforcement, stood a chain of command in which Vincent's say mattered. The murder of Thomas Ebola in 1972 shook the balance at the top, but it did not shake the way the Genovese family preferred to operate. Old school leaders used layers, one face for the public, another for the actual planning. Philip Benny Squint Lombardo, a careful man who favored invisibility, leaned on that approach. Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, visible, gregarious, and rooted in Harlem, often served as a figure everyone could point to when agents asked who ran things. In that system, Vincent advanced. He kept the village crew tight, settled disputes across boundaries with a soft voice, and expanded influence without a parade. People came to him because outcomes improved when he became involved. Around the same time, he began building a medical record that would later loom large in court. Beginning in the late 1960 seconds and continuing through the 1970 seconds, he saw doctors for symptoms that included trouble sleeping and episodes of confusion. Hospital files documented a string of visits. Family members said he struggled. Prosecutors would eventually argue it was a long game to forestall prosecution. That debate, illness, or strategy never fully ended, even after juries weighed in. What mattered in the moment was the paper trail he created and the image it cultivated. A man not quite well, distracted, simple in daily life. In public, neighbors sometimes saw him in a bathrobe and slippers, rosary in hand, moving as if untouched by the city's urgency. In private, trusted aides handled sensitive business, and meetings happened in small, controlled bursts. The 1970 seconds brought pressure from a different direction. Better law enforcement tools. Microphones got smaller, legal standards for wiretaps tightened but became clearer, and prosecutors learned to stitch together patterns rather than chase individual acts. The lessons of the Appalachian raid lingered. Agencies shared more information. Still, when agents focused on the village, they kept running into empty hands. He rarely spoke directly on subjects that mattered. If someone pushed, he changed the subject or ended the talk. People around him understood that breaking this rhythm risked more than a slap on the wrist. He rewarded patience and punished carelessness, all without leaving scenes that would end up on the front page. As the decade closed, he was widely regarded by investigators as a capo with unusual clout, a man whose reach went beyond his formal crew. He navigated relationships with other families through emissaries, let others take photographs at weddings and funerals, and stayed a step back from anything theatrical. That reserve served him well when the 1980 seconds began with a storm that would redefine the entire landscape. The government's RICO strategy matured, and the commission theory prosecutor's term for a national board of bosses coordinating policy moved from rumor to courtroom exhibits. The mid-1980 seconds commission case changed everything. Federal prosecutors charged that leaders of multiple New York families fixed big-ticket concrete jobs through what witnesses called a club. They said the bosses or their delegates approved which contractors got major projects and took a share. In that trial, Anthony Salerno sat in the chair the government labeled Genovese boss. He denied the accusation, but the jury convicted him. Years later, agents would say that Salerno was a shield, a practiced tradition in that family, and that Vincent had been the hidden decision-maker while keeping his name out of the indecipherable meeting notes. Whether or not a courtroom had reached that conclusion yet, on the street it felt plausible. He lived invisibly and guarded his influence in ways that fit the picture. The commission verdicts sent shockwaves through the unions and the trades. Some locals tried to distance themselves. Some leaders found themselves under indictment or pressure to cooperate. Prosecutors picked apart how deals were made, who skimmed what, and why certain companies always seemed to win. The response in the village was to go even quieter. The clubhouse adopted stricter routines. New faces were vetted painfully slowly. People who had chatted on sidewalks started walking a block before speaking, and only after a quick look for anyone lingering too long near parked cars. Even greetings turned into code. A nod instead of a name. A gesture toward a chair rather than an invitation to talk. In those years, another piece of the story took shape. The friction with John Gotti after the murder of Paul Castellano in 1985. Gotti's sudden takeover of the Gambino family, without the kind of broad approval the older guard preferred, outraged traditionalists. Investigators later concluded that figures in the Genovese and Lucchese outfits retaliated. The 1986 car bombing that killed Gambino underboss Frank DeCicco was, in the government's view, part of that response. with Gotti believed to be a target who escaped by chance. Defense lawyers, then and later, challenged how much could actually be pinned on Vincent. Regardless of courtroom outcomes, the rivalry forced everyone to pick each step carefully. Meetings with outsiders were limited. Internal discipline tightened. If interfamily violence escalated, the heat from law enforcement could become unbearable. That risk informed every decision. Meanwhile, income remained consistent. Sports betting stayed a backbone. Numbers games kept their loyal players. High-interest loans continued to generate returns that arrived like rent. Construction and maintenance contracts, windows, masonry, hauling still offered angles for steering work and collecting a cut. In each arena, the goal was the same. Avoid flash, encourage routine, and keep problems far from headlines. People who owed paid on time because they preferred consistency over fallout. Businesses that grumbled about costs still signed up because delays were worse than fees. If a contractor wanted a warehouse to be ready by winter, that contractor learned which envelope opened which door. At home, he kept two worlds apart. Family meals were gentle. He spent time with children and grandchildren, a grandfather who rarely raised his voice. Elsewhere, he maintained a separate household with a longtime companion. Both households would later appear in indictments and news stories, but at the time, they allowed him to occupy different roles. Patient relative in one, guarded organizer in the other. That split echoed his public life. Clergy saw a man who attended mass. Neighbors saw a shambling figure taking slow walks. Associates saw a meticulous planner who never left instructions on paper and accepted that time waiting, testing. Letting someone sweat was a tool. By the late 1982, patience met persistence. The government brought the Windows case, charging that organized figures had rigged window replacement contracts for public housing, dividing work, and inflating prices. The case spotlighted how separate families could cooperate when money flowed. Though that prosecution centered on companies and middlemen, it fit a pattern. Investigators had long argued that Vincent nurtured shared ventures that spread risk and profit while keeping top leadership insulated. Alongside it, surveillance in New York and New Jersey picked up more whispers about his role. People spoke carefully, often in nicknames, but the trail pointed toward Sullivan Street. His public persona grew even more eccentric as pressure mounted. He shuffled through the neighborhood in a robe and slippers, mumbled to himself, and sometimes stared past anyone who greeted him. He appeared at odd hours, pausing at corners as if he'd lost his way. Reporters who tried to capture the act in photographs often got a blank face and a family member steering him back indoors. To the uninitiated, it looked like decline. To investigators, it looked like cover. They studied hospital records, psychiatric evaluations, and the timeline of appointments that seemed to intensify whenever a grand jury began asking hard questions. By 1989, agents and prosecutors were closing in with a broader racketeering conspiracy that reached back years. The portrait they assembled included greenlighting violence to keep order, supervising gambling and loans, manipulating union locals and construction contracts, and using others as buffers. They believed the odd walks were theater. His lawyers insisted the symptoms were genuine. That clash image versus allegation was about to be tested in courtrooms across the river. The kind of long fight that strips away myths and makes even the most disciplined life feel suddenly fragile. Investigators moved steadily as the 80s closed, and the calm streets around Sullivan Street felt watched. Unmarked cars idled near curbs. Strangers lingered with newspapers that never turned a page. Inside cafes, conversations shrank to a murmur when unfamiliar faces appeared. Vincent kept the same ritual. Short walks, longer silences, meetings with men he had known for decades. He trusted habits more than luck. He wore ordinary clothes, favored the same stool, and let others do the talking. He understood that the city listened, and he shaped his days to give it nothing useful. Pressure came from cases that pulled threads across boroughs and rivers. In Newark, tapes caught advisors discussing rivals and retaliation. In Manhattan, prosecutors mapped trades and unions like routes on a subway map. New York's housing authority, its big construction projects, and even maintenance contracts created dependable income streams if you controlled who got the work. Officials later said that deals were set in back rooms and social clubs long before any bid was placed. and that the same circle decided where the profits went. It wasn't a smash-and-grab world. It was paperwork directed by quiet hands. In public, he leaned deeper into the image of a man drifting through his neighborhood. He appeared late at night or very early in the morning, sometimes clutching a rosary, sometimes pausing as if he had forgotten why he stepped outside. The routine built a picture. Frail, distracted, harmless. Relatives steered him away from cameras. Doctors' notes piled up. Hospital visits left records of troubled sleep, fogginess, and a need for medicine. To neighbors, it looked like decline. To agents, it looked like a curtain. Then came the window contracts that turned into a national story. Companies replacing glass in public housing buildings, the kind of work most residents never think about, became the center of a major bid-rigging prosecution. Authorities said several families split territories, fixed prices, and took a slice. Middlemen were arrested, office files were seized, and people who had long believed they were too small to matter found themselves in grand jury rooms. Vincent's name didn't appear in neon lights. It rarely did, but investigators kept drawing arrows back to the village crew, back to a leader who avoided telephones and preferred sidewalk strolls to any room with a vent large enough to hide a microphone. He didn't give speeches. He didn't claim titles. Others did that for him, sometimes without even realizing they were doing it. The tradition in his world was to present a friendly public face who absorbed attention, while the real decision-maker stayed in shadow. In earlier years, Anthony Salerno filled that role for the Genovese side, a chatty presence who played cards, posed for photos, and argued that he led. Prosecutors later said that behind Salerno stood Vincent, whose quiet carried more weight than widespread fame. Whatever outsiders believed, inside that circle a nod from him could settle a question, and a frown could freeze a plan. Tension with John Gotti didn't fade. After Paul Castellano's murder and Gotti's rise, older leaders bristled at the spectacle. A car bomb meant for Gotti instead killed his underboss, Frank DeCicco, in 1986. The government later tied that attack to a coalition of rivals who wanted to rein in the bright lights Gotti brought upon everyone. Cooperators and transcripts from bugged restaurants would become key pieces in the story officials built, one that placed Vincent among those who approved retribution. Defense attorneys challenged links and motives, and some counts never resulted in a verdict against him. Even so, the feud shaped the era. The message to crews was simple: avoid drama, avoid cameras, avoid chaos. As the early 90s arrived, prosecutors laid out sweeping racketeering charges. RICO let them treat a network as a single criminal enterprise rather than chase fragments. They said the enterprise ran gambling rooms, loan pools that charged heavy interest, construction schemes, strong-arm collections, and enforced discipline through threats and, at times, sanctioned violence. They said Vincent set policy through intermediaries, reviewed disputes, assigned territories, and signed off when serious action was proposed. His lawyers countered with medical files and testimony from family and physicians who described a man overwhelmed, not orchestrating anything. The question of health, once a private matter, now sat on a courtroom table. Competency hearings became battles of experts. Government psychiatrists described selective impairment, noting how his symptoms seemed to flare with subpoenas and fade when he thought no one was watching. Defense doctors cited decades of treatment and hospital stays, medicines prescribed by multiple professionals, and family observations about confusion and quiet. Judges weighed recordings, surveillance notes, and the timing of each hospital visit. The image of him in a robe and slippers began appearing in news broadcasts, and neighbors' stories about odd behavior were quoted in print. The public watched a tug-of-war between two narratives, declining patient or careful tactician. Meanwhile, the machine he was accused of guiding kept moving. Sports bettors still called in wagers. Card games still needed protection from robbery and from cheaters. Loans still came due on Fridays, and envelopes still swapped hands. Union influence meant slots on construction jobs and leverage over deliveries. And those positions turned into regular payments if the right people held them. When issues arose, trusted aides handled the fix. A business that felt squeezed sought relief through a mediator tied to the crew. Complaints rarely traveled to police because the resolution, though expensive, kept work flowing. That was the bargain many accepted. In 1996, a judge ruled that he could stand trial. The decision rested on the belief that he understood the proceedings and could help his lawyers. The case moved ahead in federal court in Brooklyn the following year. The indictment stacked years of alleged conduct into a single portrait, a leader who used buffers to protect himself while steering the family's operations. Jurors heard from former insiders, some from allied groups who described ceremonies, chain of command, quotas for crews, and the way serious moves required approval. Wiretaps captured coded chats about contracts and collections. Bookies described how lines were set and profit split. Contractors explained how bids were divvied up before any formal paperwork was filed. To counter, his team reminded jurors of his medical history and tried to separate him from day-to-day acts by pointing to intermediaries. The trial drew attention because it promised to settle, at least legally, who had truly run the Genovese organization during an era when the government said a figurehead stood out front. Reporters filled benches, columnists analyzed posture and pauses, and court artists sketched a man older, heavier, and quieter than the name that filled headlines. As weeks passed, the narrative hardened. Prosecutors pushed the idea of a patient builder of systems who avoided phones and trusted face-to-face contact, who taught subordinates to walk blocks and speak in fragments. The defense emphasized illness, age, and the lack of a recorded order in his own voice. In December 1997, the jury returned guilty on racketeering and related conspiracy counts tied to gambling, loans, labor rackets, and murder conspiracies advanced by his underlings. Some allegations at the edges didn't stick, but the core of the case did. The verdict answered a question law enforcement had worked on for years: whether the quiet man in the village was not only influential, but the decision-maker they believed he was. The judge later imposed a lengthy sentence and a heavy fine, noting both the scale of the enterprise and the long effort to derail the courts with claims of incapacity. He was sent into federal custody, eventually to a medical center that could handle his age and health issues. Even behind a fence, his name carried force. The family he had shaped prided itself on continuity, using acting leaders and trusted administrators to keep daily business smooth. The approach he favored: divide responsibility, keep meetings short, avoid anything theatrical, remained a template. Rotating street bosses and messengers limited exposure. If one man drew heat, another stepped forward for a time. The family avoided wars, favored steady income over spectacle, and watched the trades and unions as patiently as gardeners tending plots they expected to harvest for years. For Vincent, confinement changed the view but not the rhythm. Visits with relatives were quiet. Legal meetings continued as new cases and appeals surfaced. News clippings made their way to him, some gloating, some skeptical, many fascinated by the long charade that had played out in full view of the city. He still held rosary beads. He still moved slowly. He still said little. Outside, prosecutors kept chasing the money trails left by construction firms and service vendors. Prison slowed his stride, but not his instincts. Mornings began under fluorescent lights with the thud of doors and the rustle of paperwork. He learned the tempo of counts, the way carts squeaked along hallways, and which guards ran tight shifts. The Federal Medical Center kept him under closer watch than a standard yard. Age and the years of claimed illness made that inevitable. He carried himself with the same reserve that had defined him in the village. Visitors arrived on approved lists, talks stayed short, and nothing important passed without caution. Even in confinement, he tried to keep the habit that had shielded him for decades: say little, hint less, and let others fill silence with what they thought he meant. Outside, agents didn't relax. The view from their side showed a figure who, they believed, hadn't surrendered authority. They mapped who visited him, logged dates, and compared those calendars with activity on the street. When a bookmaker changed hands or a crew split territory, they checked whether a sit-down had occurred in a visiting room not long before. Prosecutors built a theory that the man who had cultivated invisibility was still guiding outcomes through trusted emissaries, even while wearing a prison uniform. Defense lawyers pushed back, calling it pattern hunting and a refusal to accept that younger men were making decisions without him. The disagreement marched toward a fresh indictment. Years of battles over competence had left a paper wake. Doctors had tested, interviewed, and written reports. Judges had weighed whether he could follow proceedings. The new case focused not only on racketeering, but on the long performance itself. The government alleged that he had staged symptoms to derail trials, that he had instructed those close to him to support the facade, and that the bathrobe walks were part of a strategy rather than simple decline. It was a bold charge because it asked a jury to read intention into behavior that, on its face, looked like frailty. But prosecutors arrived armed with hospital timelines, witnesses who described private clarity, and surveillance that suggested selectivity. Confusion when agents watched, coherence when old friends sat across from him. He had spent a lifetime avoiding the spotlight, yet now he faced it in a way that left no room for ambiguity. In 2003, he stood in a federal courtroom and admitted what law enforcement had argued for years. The stumbling public act had been deliberate, a wall built to impede cases. He pleaded to obstruction and related counts, accepted additional time, and told the judge he had misled the system. It was a rare moment when the mask came off. Reporters recorded his words. Old headlines about the robe and slippers became context for a confession that settled one of the era's most debated questions. Whatever people still thought about his health, he acknowledged the scheme. The court added years to the sentence he was already serving. By then, his generation was thinning. Some had disappeared into long terms, some had lost fights with illness, and others had chosen cooperation. The underworld that had once used social clubs as living rooms now faced cameras on corners and microphones the size of a shirt button. RICO cases held crews together in a single net. Financial crimes drew as much attention as fists ever had. He had built a method that emphasized caution, separation, and routine. In a strange way, the method outlasted the man. Acting leaders stepped in quickly. When one face drew heat, unions still offered leverage in places where hiring lists and delivery routes could be shaped. Construction, carting, markets, and maintenance contracts remained attractive because they generated predictable income and because influence over paperwork left fewer obvious fingerprints than street theatrics. The list of activities linked to his watch, in court filings and sworn testimony, spanned decades. There was the 1,957 shot that grazed Frank Costello's head, an act he was tried for and acquitted when Costello declined to make an identification. There was the 1,959 narcotics conspiracy conviction that sent him to federal custody early in life. There were the bread and butter rackets of gambling and high-interest lending, the collections that made Friday envelopes routine, and the discipline that kept disagreements contained. Labor racketeering mattered. Control over locals opened doors to jobs, show slots, and bargaining leverage. Investigations tied his circle to bid steering in the concrete trade and to window replacement contracts in public housing. Prosecutors said he approved retaliation during the Gotti years, including the climate that led to a car bombing aimed at a rival leadership team. They tied his family to influence at markets where fish, produce, and freight moved across docks and through warehouses, and to carting routes that made or broke small businesses. Defense attorneys fought each count line by line, won some battles, lost larger ones, and preserved the record of what was allegation and what became proven by verdict or plea. Inside the wire, days settled into simple patterns. He walked slowly around a small track when weather allowed, sat with a few elders who had also traded city blocks for cinder paths, and kept rosary beads close. Guards noted he was respectful, if guarded. He answered questions with nods more often than verbs. Mail brought family news and legal updates. Photographs from baptisms and birthdays arrived with short notes. He aged in place the same way he had aged in the village, quietly, with a tight circle, and with a mind that seldom betrayed his thoughts. Family threads tugged in both directions. Children and grandchildren carried memories of dinners, holidays, and a soft-spoken patriarch who asked about school and health. Some relatives faced accusations of passing messages or handling business while he fought cases. Over time, a few accepted plea deals. Others kept distance and lived ordinary lives. The duality that had defined him, home life gentle, street life exacting, played out around him even as his world narrowed to schedules he didn't control. He tried to hold both pictures without comment, a trait that had served him from the first day he learned that secrets kept breathing when they stayed in the chest. His generation bridged two eras, the tail end of the old neighborhood order and the rise of a surveillance state that made hidden empires harder to sustain. When he was young, power gathered in back rooms, and the only record of a conversation was memory. By his final decade, an offhand line in a car could appear in open court, replayed through speakers to rows of strangers. The shift punished flamboyance and rewarded patience. That had been his edge. and it remained the Genovese hallmark after his conviction. Stay steady, avoid wars, prefer contracts to headlines, and let rivals burn themselves with pride. Illness crept in as the years advanced. Heart trouble, the wear that comes from age, and the accumulated strain of stress and confinement shaped his final seasons. He was moved for care more than once, landing in a facility designed for inmates who needed clinics close by. The fluorescent hum, the antiseptic smell, the careful choreography of medicine rounds all of it, replaced the crackle of village sidewalks and the hiss of espresso machines. In that setting, the man who had treated visibility as a weapon slipped further from public view than he ever could have managed on his own. He died in 2005 inches federal custody, an old man who had become famous by pretending to fade. The news ran everywhere. Commentators summed up a life that began in a crowded apartment, moved through boxing gyms and backseats of cars, rose through a structure that prized discipline, and culminated in trials that named him a leader, even as he shuffled past cameras in nightclothes. Some headlines chose the nickname that fused eccentricity with authority. Others emphasized the admission that he had staged a long deception. Families who had lived near him in the village remembered a quiet neighbor. Agents remembered a chess player who seldom moved a piece without three purposes in mind. Lawyers remembered a client who could sit through a day and reveal nothing. His passing did not erase the past. Court records kept the official story, convictions, pleas, and sentences spelled out in careful language. Transcripts preserved the voices of former associates who, for reasons of survival or conscience, described the inner workings of crews, the way profits were split, and how serious acts required sanction from the top. Old address books, seized in raids, captured the connective tissue between small businesses and big decisions. The city's skyline, built and maintained by trades he once influenced, stood as a silent ledger of those relationships, the honest and the bent woven together in glass, steel, and concrete. What remains most striking about his life is the discipline. He understood that strength in his world came not from noise, but from consistency. He avoided cameras before cameras became everywhere. He relied on face-to-face talks long after phones became cheaper than coffee. He trained a circle to use first names sparingly and to treat routine as armor. For decades, that culture let him shape outcomes without taking bows. In the end, the same restraint produced the admission that tore down a wall he had built brick by brick. He had outlasted many storms, but not the last one. The arc from boyhood in Greenwich Village to a final day under hospital lights reads like a study in control. He learned to measure distance in the ring, then measured it again in boardrooms and on sidewalks where a glance could settle a debt. He spent years arranging ventures that turned city systems into revenue streams. Numbers, games in back rooms, sports betting lines adjusted by dawn, envelopes pushed across counters on Fridays, jobs steered on work sites so that the right truck arrived at the right gate. He brokered peace when conflict threatened profit. He allowed retribution when order required it, in the reckoning of his world. He treated unions, supply chains, and markets as instruments, not trophies. And he did it mostly without fanfare, letting others soak up applause or blame. After he was gone, the organization he had shaped kept moving under new hands, still wary of spectacle, still favoring paperwork over noise. His methods remained a template precisely because they survived the longest. Time showed that even in the brightest city, darkness can be orderly if the person guiding it understands how to make the ordinary do the work. That was his craft. It made him a contradiction. A public ghost whose influence left fingerprints on deals, docs, and contracts, and a family man who tried, imperfectly, to keep that other life from crossing the front door. When the news of his death settled and the city returned to its rush, people who had studied him kept unpacking how a life like that actually worked. They looked past the bathrobe and the whispers to the system he had built, a structure that favored patient control over spectacle. Long before a courtroom called him a leader, he had learned to move cautiously through a world that punished noise. That habit became style, and style became strategy. You could trace it in every corner of his story, the way meetings stayed short, the way orders moved through buffers, the way money arrived on time without scenes. That was the spine of his power. Investigators said his rise followed the old village path. Errands that grew into trusted jobs, then a driver's seat close to the people who made decisions, then stewardship of a crew that handled steady earners. The daily business was familiar in that era. sports betting lines during football season and baseball summers, numbers in tenement basements and back rooms, loan pools that charged heavy interest to gamblers, shop owners, and workers who fell behind, quiet pressure on certain union locals, whose leverage over who got hired, and when deliveries arrived, could turn a trickle into a stream. People who dealt with him rarely described shouting. They remembered a nod, a pause, and an outcome that arrived because everyone involved understood consequences without anyone speaking them out loud. The record showed 2 early legal shocks that shaped his reputation. In 1957, he was tried for the attempt on Frank Costello and acquitted because Costello would not identify the gunman. In 1959, he was convicted in a federal narcotics conspiracy and sent away, a setback that paradoxically strengthened his standing in a culture that equated silence with loyalty. Those beats defined the template he followed afterward. He never forgot that a case can fall apart if evidence is thin and if witnesses stay careful. He also never forgot that a conviction, served without cooperation, can lift a man rather than end him. He came back to the village after prison with a deeper sense of how to move without leaving tracks. By the time Vito Genovese's era gave way to a quieter style under figures like Philip Lombardo, the family's public face and its private hand often diverged. Prosecutors later argued that Anthony Salerno played a visible role, while the true direction flowed from less photographed men. Inside that frame, Vincent expanded his reach over the west side and downtown. People brought disputes to him because settlements held when he shaped them. Crews respected boundaries, profits moved in predictable patterns, and the kind of reckless brawling that drew front-page attention stayed rare. That steadying influence, in law enforcement's view, made him not just a capo but the center of gravity for the organization in the 1982 and beyond. Court cases from that period reveal a map of income sources that reached into many corners of city life. Concrete, windows, trucking, produce markets, and waterfront work all appeared in indictments or consent decrees over the years. The Concrete Club, as witnesses called it, set who won large pours for high-rise projects, with a fixed slice skimmed before any cement mixed. The Windows prosecution in the late 1982 exposed agreements that inflated prices on public housing glass replacement and divvied up territories among companies linked to multiple families. The carting industry faced its own cleanup as monopolies over commercial routes were pried open. In each arena, the pattern was similar: steer contracts, keep leaders insulated, and treat paperwork as a shield. Prosecutors said the Genovese side under Vincent preferred those angles because they brought steady returns and carried less risk than chaos in the street. His feud with the new regime and the Gambino family after 1985 became a second spine of the story. John Gotti's surge to the top, achieved in a public way that many veterans found reckless, sharpened divisions. The 1986 car bomb that killed Frank DeCicco signaled, in the government's telling, a coordinated strike at that spectacle. Cooperators and surveillance placed Vincent among those who approved taking the fight to Gotti's circle. Defense lawyers pushed back and won limits on what could be tied directly to him, but the broader effect was undeniable. Everyone tightened up. Meetings crossed family lines only when essential. Intermediaries multiplied. The logic that had always guided him, less light, more control, hardened into policy across the 5 families as federal pressure rose. Then came the turning point that fixed his name in court records for a generation. Rico let prosecutors build a single case from what used to be scattered charges. After years of fitness hearings and delays anchored in medical files, he finally faced a jury in 1997. The government's narrative reached back over years and crossed borough lines. Gambling pools and bookmaking shops, loan collections enforced by reputation, contracts tilted toward insiders, union influence leveraged for payoffs, and conspiracies to approve violence when discipline required it. Witnesses explained the rank structure and the approval process for serious actions. Recordings captured coded talk about money, projects, and personnel. The defense countered with decades of treatment notes and testimony that painted him as a man too fogged to mastermind anything. Jurors weighed 2 pictures and returned a verdict that the enterprise existed and that he had led it. The sentence, heavy in years and fines, marked the end of his freedom. The last major chapter came when the government accused him of turning illness into a legal shield. Beginning in the late 1960s, he had built a medical trail: doctor visits, hospitalizations, prescriptions that would later make a court pause, and ask whether he could aid his lawyers. That record complicated every hearing. In 2003, after he had already been in custody on the racketeering case, he admitted that the public displays bathrobe walks, muttered prayers on street corners, vacant stares at cameras were staged to frustrate investigators and judges. He pleaded to obstruction and accepted more time. The admission settled a long argument about the line between sickness and strategy. However the symptoms began, he had used them to buy delays, and he finally said so in open court. What remained after the legal battles ended was a study in method. He taught subordinates to avoid telephones for sensitive matters, to strip meetings down to essentials, and to let allies carry messages rather than carry exposure. He treated loyalty as both a moral and a practical requirement. People who stood firm during hard seasons earned protection and opportunity. Those who rushed, bragged, or ignored reminders about caution found themselves sidelined, sometimes permanently. On the business side, he gravitated to ventures that paid like clockwork, bookmaking that cycled every week, numbers, games that had loyal neighborhoods, and job sites where control over deliveries or labor lists translated into quiet income. When projects went wrong, he preferred negotiation to fireworks. When a message had to be sent, he kept its delivery targeted and brief, in the language of that world, not in the scenes that shock the broader public. His personal life contained its own contrasts. He loved his children and grandchildren, tried to keep their days separate from his work, and remained close to relatives who chose different paths. A brother served as a priest and a community leader, a striking counterpoint to the headlines that later defined Vincent's name. He also maintained a relationship outside his marriage that lasted for decades. Those facts surfaced in filings and articles during the final prosecutions, not as scandal for its own sake, but because the government said that the second household sometimes served as a channel for messages. Even in that realm, he was old-fashioned, polite at the table, protective of family privacy, and careful about who entered the front door. One reason his organization kept its reputation as the most careful of the New York groups was the way he and his mentors handled succession. When bosses went away, acting leaders stepped forward with clear instructions and limited autonomy. Administrators tracked earnings and disputes. Capos ran crews as franchises with accountability. That corporate feel, as analysts called it, turned out to be resilient. Even as Rico reshaped the legal environment, the Genovese side adapted by keeping the old habits. Use front leaders when useful. Keep the true strategist off stage. Let money, not ego, set the agenda. People who have studied that era often say, you can see his fingerprints on that culture even after he was gone. The case record tied his career to specific markets beyond construction as well. The Fulton fish market saw waves of reform that courts and city agencies pushed through after years of mob influence. The Genovese family long held sway there through men who took weekly cuts and enforced monopolies. Produced distribution hubs and wholesale districts also appeared in complaints and indictments. Some rackets faded as the city modernized and as civil suits stripped control from corrupt locals. Others morphed, with newer faces taking over old angles. Through all of it, the through line was similar. The money mattered, not the headlines, and the quickest way to lose money was to chase attention. He never bragged in public about what he'd done. Reporters never got the one-liners that made John Gotti a tabloid character. What they got, until the day he admitted the act, was a shambling figure who seemed barely aware of the commotion around him. That performance worked for years because it fit with other pieces of truth. He was aging. He had been under strain. He genuinely enjoyed quiet neighborhood walks. He had a habit of holding a rosary. Layering theater on top of those facts created the perfect cover. People who wanted to believe the image needed only to look out a window at dawn and see him shuffle by. His story does not end with his passing so much as it folds into the city's memory. The apartment blocks and church bells of his childhood, the gyms where he learned patience, the cafes where he preferred the corner seat, the clubhouses where no one raised a voice. Those places tell you why that method thrived. A crowded city rewards the person who can keep daily life smooth. That was his core lesson. If gamblers could place bets without trouble, if contractors could finish jobs on time, if union members could work steady shifts, the system he shaped could keep drawing income without making the front page. When heat arrived, he tightened the circle and waited it out. That is why he lasted longer than men who chased thrones and cameras. The ledger of his life, as the courts recorded it, is clear. A tried and acquitted attempt on a top rival. A narcotics conviction early on. Decades of illegal gambling and loans. Systemic labor corruption that reached from hiring halls to high-rise sites. Bid manipulation in city contracts. Conspiracies to approve violent responses during tense years. And, in the end, an admission that he spent years pretending to be lost in order to mislead judges. There are also items that investigators said were true but that never became verdicts, the kind of claims that sit in files and in the testimony of cooperators. He lived in the gap between those worlds, what could be proved and what was whispered, and used that space to build a career that outlasted many of his peers. What makes that career still compelling is not glamour but control. He treated power as something you measure in solved problems and predictable income, not in photographs. He trained himself to wait, to let others talk, to let a week pass before making a call, so that tempers settled and plans became clearer. He understood the city's rhythms and found places where a small tilt could produce a steady return. He knew that fear shouted but respect could whisper. And he understood that the most durable lie is the one that looks like an ordinary day. A man in slippers, a prayer on his lips, a slow walk to the corner and back, while the gears he set in motion kept turning far from the camera's lens. The neighborhood where he learned patience still holds clues to how everything worked. Sullivan Street was narrow, shaded by old trees, and ordinary enough that a person could vanish in plain sight. The Triangle Social Club sat there like a living room that belonged to the block. Men stopped in for espresso, played cards, and left by different doors. Nothing looked dramatic. If a serious conversation was needed, it happened during a slow stroll, or in the back of a shop where the hum of a compressor or a clatter of dishes masked stray words. That rhythm, short whispers, long pauses, kept intentions as faint as steam on a winter morning. People who came to him with problems expected a decision, not a speech. A shop owed money, a better wanted more time. Two crews disputed who serviced a building. A contractor worried about a delivery schedule. He listened, weighed the histories, and chose the outcome that protected revenue and calm. He preferred settlements that stuck. You could call it arbitration with a hard edge. It worked because everyone involved understood the cost of ignoring the result, a cost that didn't need to be spelled out to be convincing. It also worked because he rarely moved too fast. Time softened tempers and clarified motives. Union halls were another part of the map. Influence over a local meant control over hiring lists, overtime, and which crew worked which site. With that leverage, a person could tilt a bid without raising a voice. Court papers later described how certain shops paid to keep deliveries on schedule, or to avoid unexpected inspections that could shut down a pour or stall a crane. Ghost and no-show jobs padded payrolls. The envelopes moved quietly. The money wasn't only in big headline projects. It lived in the smaller contracts windows, masonry, hauling, security, where a nudge could turn a thin margin into a payday. The concrete club, as witnesses called it in court, summed up this approach. Major pours for towers didn't land by luck. Prosecutors said a small circle decided who got work, and those companies built the fee into their prices. Everybody along that chain understood the rules. City agencies tried to break the pattern through indictments, consent decrees, and monitors. Some firms were barred, some executives cooperated, and the market shifted. Yet the lesson outlasted individual cases. The quiet hand on the bid sheet mattered more than any ribbon cutting, and the quiet hand didn't show up in publicity photos. Public housing window contracts revealed the same logic with a different surface. Cities buy a lot of glass. If rivals agree to carve up territories, bidders can appear to compete while protecting price and margin. Middlemen took orders, companies submitted paperwork, and residents saw workers replace panes without ever knowing how the job had been assigned. The prosecution in that case didn't claim he hammered nails or measured frames. It claimed the leadership tiers benefited from a system that steered work and skimmed slices. That's how rackets were built in his world. Far from flashy crimes, close to paperwork. Markets and peers offered their own angles. The Fulton Fish Market, for decades, operated by a code that made room for weekly tributes and an expectation that trucks moved smoothly when the right people were satisfied. Produce hubs and warehousing districts showed similar patterns. Investigations and city reforms pushed hard in the 1,990 seconds to clean out long-standing pressures, introducing background checks, new permits, and surprise audits. Those efforts, reported widely, shrank old revenue streams. But they also illustrated how deeply the network had once reached into the city's supply lines. He didn't need to stand on a pier to benefit. He needed reliable lieutenants who could turn a lever, here and there, without shaking the structure. Across the river, New Jersey offered a quieter landscape with familiar tools. Industrial parks, trucking routes, and union locals created chances to earn with less foot traffic and fewer cameras than Midtown. The Genovese group had history there dating back to earlier generations, so bridges already existed. Trusted captains oversaw loans, betting, and contracts tied to maintenance and freight. Though he stayed loyal to the village, the web touched both sides of the Hudson, and prosecutors later mapped that reach in charging papers that counted acts in both states as part of one enterprise. The argument over his health shadowed everything. Doctors' notes and hospital logs stacked up over decades, and relatives described confusion, sleeplessness, and a man who sometimes seemed lost. Agents, however, kept lists that showed another pattern. Clear moments when the stakes were private, muddled ones when the stakes were legal. They put surveillance on doorways and watched who went in and out. They bugged rooms and cars, caught coded chatter, and tried to match it with the calendar of his appointments. Over time, the pieces formed a picture they believed was deliberate. In court, he eventually agreed that the bathrobe walks and vacant stairs were part of a plan to delay justice. That confession did more than add years. It closed a chapter of uncertainty that had animated talk shows and court columns. The Oddfather nickname had made him a character. His admission returned him to the realm of strategy. It also changed how future cases treated medical defenses. Judges, remembering the long fight around his competency, asked sharper questions, required more independent evaluations, and compared symptom timelines with investigative milestones. His case became a lesson in how persistence, by both sides, shapes legal standards. Inside his circle, discipline stayed tight. He prized men who could keep tempers in check and ignore the urge to show off. If a bookmaker bragged in a bar, he might be demoted. If a collector took liberties with someone who paid on time, he could be replaced. The currency was trust. He selected people who had proven they could sit in a diner for an hour and leave without saying anything important out loud. That sounds simple, but it's rare. He believed the easiest way to beat a wire was to give it nothing, and the easiest way to avoid a witness was to make sure few people knew much. Money moved in ways that looked ordinary. A slice from a card game covered a roof repair. A monthly skim from a union job funded a lawyer's retainer. A steady line from sports betting paid rent for a storefront. Cash-heavy businesses, restaurants, bars, service shops sometimes served as buffers for deposits. Prosecutors later called these acts laundering. Defense lawyers called them routine bookkeeping by small firms. The truth, as jurors often heard, was in patterns. When the same operator kept showing up around the same cash flows, questions followed. He kept personal gestures local and low-key. A church fundraiser received an envelope. A neighbor's medical bill was covered quietly. A youth team got uniforms. Those acts helped build goodwill on blocks where whispers traveled. People who might have resented envelopes demanded by others had reasons to stay polite when he passed. That doesn't erase the harm of loans that trapped borrowers or the way rigged bids lifted prices for taxpayers. It just shows how he mixed soft power with hard rules to stabilize his base. The feud with the Gambino leadership after 1985 never quite vanished from the backdrop. Even after big trials put men away, the memory of the car bombing and the years of glare that followed Gotti's rise reminded everyone why discretion mattered. Sit-downs with other families occurred through emissaries in quiet suburbs or in the back of businesses where surveillance was harder. Shifts in leadership elsewhere rarely triggered fireworks from his side. Patience paid better than pride. That stance protected revenue and reduced the risk of long wars that drained coffers and stuffed cells. His own time inside brought an odd version of normal. He woke to the same clatter, walked the same loop, and waited for visits on schedules he didn't control. Old friends aged into canes. Newcomers learned to keep their voices low. He read when he could, prayed often, and let days stack without complaint. Guards learned he was courteous and quiet. Lawyers visited with updates when a cooperator appeared, or when a motion might shave months. Appeals chipped at the edges. The main sentence stood. The man who had once governed his hours now lived by bells. Even then, analysts studying the Genovese operation saw his influence in how the group adapted. Acting leaders stepped in with limited authority and a mandate to avoid noise. Administrators kept books as if they worked in a cautious firm, tracking take-ins and payments, mediating disputes, and keeping crews apart enough to prevent rivalry. The idea was not to mimic a corporation for show, but because that structure survived pressure. When one man caught a case, the machine didn't seize. Another rotated in. That culture, shaped by old lessons from his mentors and refined during his tenure, carried forward after he was gone. Neighbors remembered small things. He walked with his head slightly down, a habit from childhood that made him look modest even when he was measuring a room. He liked strong coffee but never lingered long enough to draw attention. He tipped well. He greeted priests with respect and told kids to stay in school. Those memories coexisted with headlines about rackets and trials. It is tempting to separate the two pictures, to say the kindly neighbor was different from the man who rigged bids and ran loan pools. In truth, they were the same person, choosing different tools for different rooms. The legal record that defines him is not a mystery. He was acquitted in the Costello case when a witness withheld identification. He was convicted in the narcotics conspiracy a couple of years later. He rose through a structure that made money through gambling, loans, labor racketeering, and contract manipulation. He was found guilty of racketeering and related conspiracies in 1997. He pleaded to obstruction in 2003, after admitting he had staged cognitive decline to stall cases. He died in federal custody in 2005. Around those anchors sits a web of allegations, affidavits, surveillance logs, and testimony that fill archives and explain why agents called him the most careful of his era. The city he shaped has changed. Social clubs closed or turned into restaurants. Unions reformed under monitors. Markets adopted tighter rules. Technology put cameras in every pocket and microphones in every room. Yet the lesson from his career still matters. The strongest shields are routine, patience, and humility in public. Others chased limelight and found themselves on front pages beside indictments. He chased predictable income and let other people's faces absorb attention. Even his famous disguise, a robe, slippers, a vacant gaze, was just an extension of that principle. Let the performance draw the flash so the work can stay dim. If there is a caution to draw for any era, it is this. Power tied to fear eventually attracts pressure. Power tied to quiet systems can last but not forever. Investigators evolve, laws adapt, markets reform. He delayed, rather than defeated that arc. In doing so, he left a record that doubles as a manual for both sides, how to hide and how to search. For a boy from a crowded apartment who learned footwork in a ring and patience on stoops, that is a stark legacy. It's not romantic. It's organized, methodical, often cold, and built to survive. And for a long time, it did. Long after headlines faded, pieces of his world kept surfacing in court files and interviews. Small details that explained how a quiet man moved levers that touched so many corners of the city. You could see it in the way the Triangle Social Club functioned like a neighborhood living room. People drifted in at different hours, never staying long, never talking on a phone, always careful to treat the place as background rather than a stage. A visitor might spot him at a small table with a demitasse, nodding more than speaking, as if the room itself understood what he wanted. That style, understated, consistent, became the blueprint for how business was conducted across decades. His power wasn't built on dramatic scenes. It came from rules that everyone around him absorbed. If you had to discuss money, you walked. If you had to make a decision, you kept it brief and avoided names. If a sensitive issue lingered, you broke it into pieces and handled each part with a different person in a different place. People learned to leave watches and pens outside certain rooms, to speak while water ran or while a delivery truck idled out back. He believed that the best protection was not a wall of muscle but a fog of ordinary life. Coffee, cards, short greetings, and errands that looked like nothing. The businesses tied to his era ran on predictability. Sports betting handled lines for football, baseball, basketball, and boxing. Wagers moved through runners who knew which numbers to memorize and which names not to repeat. Numbers games thrived in neighborhoods that treated them like a community ritual. High-interest loans filled the gaps when gamblers fell behind, or small shop owners needed cash fast. Collections were firm but staged to avoid disruption. Owners kept their doors open. Gamblers came back to play again. And the circle continued. The point was not drama. The point was a steady Friday envelope. Labor influence carried that logic into the trades. A local with the right stewards could decide who worked overtime, which crew got the night shift, and which supplier's truck rolled through the gate at 6 a.m. That leverage opened doors for contractors who cooperated and closed them for those who didn't, all without a raised voice. Cash changed hands in back offices and parking lots, logged nowhere, but in memory. Those streams fed the organization's stability. Construction contracts, concrete, windows, masonry, hauling, brought in predictable money precisely because they didn't look like crimes to people passing a job site. They looked like workdays, hard hats, and cranes swinging slowly against a blue sky. When prosecutors wrote their biggest cases, they described how these pieces fit together. Witnesses explained that major concrete jobs for high-rise buildings didn't land randomly. A core group approved which firm got which pour and set a surcharge that traveled up the chain. The windows case showed a similar mechanism around public housing contracts. Territories carved up, prices padded, profits shared. Markets and peers told their own story. The Fulton Fish Market had traditions that functioned like unwritten bylaws. Trucks moved quicker when the right people were satisfied. Produce hubs and warehouse districts showed comparable patterns. Investigations in the 1,990 seconds forced reforms, permits, background checks, monitors, but those changes only underscored how deeply the network had once embedded itself. Inside that framework, he avoided showmanship. He rarely appeared at weddings where cameras clustered. He let others carry visible titles, as when Anthony Salerno sat in the chair the government labeled boss during the mid-1,980 seconds trial that dismantled the commission's hold over the trades. Years later, agents and cooperators would say Salerno had been a shield while decisions flowed through the village. Whether or not the world agreed in that moment, the method mattered more than the argument. He kept using buffers and face-to-face meetings because they kept cases thin. For a long stretch, it worked. Tension with John Gotti's team, born from the 1,985 power grab, and the glare that followed, tested these preferences. Authorities later concluded that a coalition of rivals targeted Gotti's inner circle to cool the spotlight. The 1,986 car bombing that killed Frank DeCicco stood as the loudest incident in that campaign. Prosecutors argued that figures from the Genovese and Lucchese sides participated. Defense attorneys fought the links. Whatever the final count in any court, the moment hardened a lesson his people had already been taught. Attention brings heat, and heat brings cases. That principle guided how he handled disputes. When a bookmaker complained that a rival had poached clients, he didn't order a scene. He assigned borders and demanded compliance. When a contractor balked at a surcharge, he didn't send a crowd. He sent a calm face who made clear that schedules would suffer unless terms were met. If someone fell behind on a loan and had a plan to catch up, he listened. If stalling became a habit, stronger measures followed. People who dealt with him understood that calm did not mean softness. It meant decisions arrived without theatrics and stuck because the cost of defiance was known. The legal calendar running through the late 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds told the other half of the story. He faced a sweeping racketeering case that wrapped gambling, loans, labor rackets, and conspiracies to approve violent acts into one charge sheet. For years he avoided trial, as judges weighed his capacity to understand proceedings. Family members described confusion. Doctors documented sleeplessness and erratic behavior. And neighbors saw him shuffle through the neighborhood in a robe, murmuring prayers. Agents compiled a different timeline, pointing to lucid moments and selective symptoms. When the court finally ruled he could stand trial, the jury heard from former insiders who mapped the hierarchy, described quotas for weekly collections, and explained how important steps required sign-off. Recordings backed up pieces of that testimony. The verdict in 1997, guilty on racketeering and related conspiracies, put him in federal custody for what were expected to be the rest of his years. Still, one unresolved question lingered. Was the public confusion real? In 2003, he answered it himself. He admitted in open court, that the street corner performance was a tactic to delay justice. He pleaded guilty to obstruction and accepted more time. The confession drew a line under a debate that had run for decades in newspapers and courtrooms. The act had been studied, persistent, and for a long while, effective. His admission didn't erase the medical history. It reframed it, acknowledging that whatever symptoms he had experienced, he also used an image of incapacity to protect himself. From a prison medical center, he watched the organization he had shaped continue on its careful course. Acting leaders stepped forward with modest profiles. Administrators preferred ledgers to gossip. Capos ran crews like steady franchises with weekly targets. The Genovese side leaned into boring routines. No wars, no parades, just revenue and quiet. When an indictment hit, someone else rotated in, guided by standing instructions to keep meetings short and to use public places where ambient noise made microphones struggle. Agents might laugh about the old tricks, but the old tricks still complicated their work. His family ties reflected the complexity of a life lived in two spheres. He had a lawful marriage, children he tried to keep far from headlines, and a second household that, years later, attracted attention from investigators who said messages passed through that door. Some relatives faced charges of their own in later years and took pleas. Others chose distance. A brother served as a priest and a community advocate, celebrated by parishioners and at times questioned by reporters because of the bloodline he shared. The contrast between a clergyman's vocation and a mob boss's career became part of his public story, a reminder that families can hold contradictions without breaking. Colleagues from his earliest days in the ring remembered a quiet teenager with good defense and a knack for distance. Those habits didn't vanish when he hung up gloves. He kept opponents at bay by stepping out of range in conversation. He masked intentions by allowing others to lead. In the ring, you're taught not to telegraph a punch. On Sullivan Street, he applied the same lesson to every choice and trained others to do it as well. That cross-pollination between boxing and business is one of the reasons his legend endured. The method felt simple, yet few could stick to it the way he did. There were losses along the way. Not every case went his way. The 1,959 narcotics conviction sent him to federal prison at an age when others were just building reputations. He weathered raids, flipped associates, and a slowly modernizing police force that learned to view a city like a network rather than a patchwork of isolated crews. He outlasted rivals who chased attention, but even his caution could not defeat time and technology. Smaller microphones, tougher statutes, better information sharing, and sophisticated financial analysis squeezed margins and exposed patterns that once looked like noise. The law adapted, and so did he until it didn't matter anymore. Yet the story isn't simply about cases won or lost. It's about how an urban ecosystem functioned for decades. A baker paid a little more for flour because a trucking route was controlled. A contractor added a percentage to a bid because a concrete pour had to pass through a gate someone else managed. A gambler's Friday envelope supported a payroll slot for someone who rarely appeared on a site. The costs dispersed into the city like mist, felt by many, seen by few. When reforms came, market cleanups, union monitors, open bidding requirements, they felt bureaucratic, but they were cutting at roots that had fed those old streams. He died in 2005, an old man under fluorescent lights instead of street lamps. News anchors reminded viewers of the bathrobe, the nickname, the confession. Prosecutors talked about a patient tactician whose voice rarely appeared on tape. Defense lawyers noted that the system had accepted his incompetency claims for years and argued that the government had relied heavily on cooperators whose motives were complicated. Neighbors remembered a polite figure who tipped well and told kids to study. All of it was true in its own lane, and together it formed a portrait of someone who understood how to live two lives in one zip code. What stands out, looking back, is not a single spectacular episode but the durability of a method. He invested in relationships that smoothed daily life. He disciplined crews to prevent uncontrolled violence. He placed buffers between decisions and daylight. He preferred industries where influence over schedules and lists translated into quiet income. He accepted that patience was a weapon. In a city addicted to noise, he practiced the art of the ordinary. That approach created fewer short-term thrills but much longer arcs of control. For those who track organized crime as history rather than spectacle, his career marks a pivot point. He absorbed lessons from an older generation Vito Genovese, Philip Lombardo, then refined them for an age of Rico and microelectronics. He demonstrated how a boss could survive by being, in public, almost nobody. He proved that a convincing public weakness could serve as armor, until it was peeled back in court. He left behind an organization that still prizes steadiness over glory, and a legal record that helped shape how courts handle claims of incapacity and how agencies monitor unions, markets, and municipal contracts. If you walk those village blocks today, the social club is gone, turned into something bright and ordinary. Cafes are full of laptops, not low murmurs. Yet you can still see, if you tilt your head, why that corner birthed the method. The streets are close, voices carry, and people learn quickly what to say and what not to say. He grew up in that mix and turned it into a shield and a lever. That shield could not stop everything. It slowed much, and while it held, money moved like a tide he could time with a watch. He never wrote a memoir. The closest we have are transcripts, wiretap snippets, plea colloquies, and the institutional memory of investigators, lawyers, and neighbors. Those sources paint a consistent picture, a craftsman of caution, a planner who preferred systems to stunts, and a leader who accepted responsibility in court only when the path to denial was closed. He did real harm to real people, borrowers trapped by debt, taxpayers overcharged by rigged bids, workers locked out of jobs because a list was sold rather than earned. And yet the way he presented himself on a stoop, gentle voice, patient pause, a nod that ended an argument left many with complicated feelings. The lesson, if there is one that belongs at the end of a long day, is simple. In a world built on attention, the surest path to longevity is often the opposite. He turned quiet into a shield, habit into policy, and restraint into a kind of gravity that drew money toward him for years. Courts broke the spell. Time closed the book. The city moved on. But for a season, a man in a worn robe could step onto a stoop in Greenwich Village, and with almost no words at all, keep an empire humming where most people just heard the hiss of steam and the clink of cups. Years later, as cafes filled with laptops and new residents walked dogs past old stoops, memory lingered in the brick and light of those short village blocks. People who had watched him age into a figure half seen on sidewalks told stories in low voices. Some remembered the boxer who kept his hands up and his words down. Others recalled the driver who opened doors for men who set policy. Old-timers spoke of a neighbor who sent over pastries after a birth, or slipped a donation into a parish basket. Reporters, lawyers, and agents sifted all of it against what documents confirmed: indictments, plea minutes, surveillance notes, and the steady thump of court stamps that tracked his life from a crowded apartment to a quiet hospital room behind a fence. Archives filled in outlines that gossip never could. Tapes caught managers whispering about union lists. Ledgers seized in raids showed payouts wrapped in ordinary expenses. Trial exhibits mapped how a surcharge could hide inside a contract and roll uphill through a chain of vendors. The portrait that emerged was not paint thrown on a wall. It was pencil work, careful lines. He didn't chase headlines. He chased systems that paid regularly. The list was long. Sports betting that turned every game into a small market. Numbers games that felt like a neighborhood ritual. High-interest lending that trapped some borrowers for years. Bargaining power over locals that tilted hiring, overtime, and deliveries. Influence in construction and maintenance contracts. Pressure in markets where fish, produce, and freight moved before dawn. When violence surfaced, it was presented as enforcement of rules, not show. Prosecutors later bundled those acts into racketeering charges and murder conspiracies, arguing that nothing serious happened without approval from the top. In that world, patience ranked just behind loyalty. He told people to wait, to let anger cool, to measure what a problem might cost next month instead of tomorrow morning. He preferred settlements that kept everyone earning. A fence about a boundary here, a quiet penalty there, and the machine kept humming. When debtors dragged their feet too long or when a rival ignored a line, sharper pressure followed. The point wasn't spectacle. The point was compliance without chaos. That approach made money flow and kept cases rare, at least for a time. The law's adjustment arrived in steps. The commission trial in the mid-1980 seconds treated the industry of concrete like a single board, where major pours were decided by a handful of men. That case put Anthony Salerno in the chair prosecutors labeled boss and sent him away. Years later, witnesses and agents said the label masked the true chain of command, placing Vincent as the quiet hand behind the curtain. The Windows prosecution showed how window replacement work in public housing could be carved into territories and priced as if bids were free, even when families at the top already knew the outcome. Cleanup at the Fulton Fish Market and other hubs used permits and background checks to break old habits. A city office, the one that vets carding, markets, and some waterfront trades, emerged as a day-to-day guardrail. RICO let prosecutors treat a network as an enterprise. Reforms gave regulators a wrench to turn daily. Both forces squeezed the margins where he had once felt safest. He answered by getting smaller in public. The bathrobe walks that fed a nickname were part theater, part shield. Doctors' notes backed a long, complex record of treatment. Relatives described sleepless nights, foggy mornings, and a man who sometimes seemed to drift. Yet agents saw selectivity, muddle when subpoenas neared, clarity when meetings with old friends took place out of earshot. After years of hearings, a court said he could stand trial. In 1997, jurors convicted him on racketeering and conspiracy counts tied to gambling, loans, labor racketeering, and approved violence carried out by subordinates. The sentence carried years and a heavy fine. In 2003, he admitted in open court that he had staged confusion to delay proceedings and took additional time for obstruction. That confession didn't erase illness. It acknowledged strategy layered on top of it. Inside a federal medical center, he settled into routines controlled by bells. He walked slow laps, prayed, and accepted that visits happened when a schedule said they would. The circle that had once gathered in a village clubhouse now sat across from him at a plastic table under a guard's glance. Out on the street, others kept the structure steady. Acting leaders rotated in. Administrators tracked earnings and disputes with an accountant's patience. Crews tended steady earners. The Genovese group leaned into what had always separated it. Boring predictability. If a captain drew fire, another filled in. If an indictment named a face, the machine didn't pause. That continuity, built over decades, outlasted the man who had refined it. His last years ended far from the sidewalks where his disguise once drew cameras. He died in 2005 at a federal medical facility. An old man whose public image had been a shambling walk and a distant gaze. Newsrooms reached for familiar phrases. Some told the tale of a mastermind who hid behind a robe. Others emphasized the admission that he had fooled judges for years. Neighbors remembered a soft voice and steady tips. Detectives remembered the irritation of tapes that caught everything but a direct order in his voice. Attorneys on both sides recalled a decade of hearings that taught courts to test competency claims with sharper tools. A funeral in the neighborhood where he grew up drew a mix of mourners and onlookers. Clergy offered prayers that focused on soul and mercy, not headlines. Police watched the doors. Reporters stood half a block away, scribbling notes as family members slipped in quietly. The faces were older now. Some had chosen other paths long ago. A brother in the clergy carried his own complicated public life as a community leader. A reminder that bloodlines can run to very different places under one roof. Obituaries tried to reconcile those threads. The gentle grandfather at a Sunday table, the strategist who steered a hidden enterprise, the patient defendant who let years pass while his attorneys fought, the inmate who admitted that a public performance had been a legal tactic. What followed his death was less drama than drift. The organization moved forward under caretakers who embraced low profiles. Law enforcement kept attention on unions, carting routes, produce hubs, and construction firms. Civil suits and monitors chipped away at old practices. Younger people entering trades worked under rules designed to keep lists clean and bids open. No reform holds perfectly, but the gap between past and present widened enough that the old routines became history rather than habit. In that sense, his career marked a turning of the page, even as his methods lingered in small ways wherever discretion still pays. The costs of his world often landed in quiet places. A diner paid a little more for deliveries year after year. A tenant waited longer for repairs because a contract carried an extra cut. A laborer lost overtime when a list tilted toward a favorite. None of those moments made breaking news. Added together, they formed a tax without a law, collected in envelopes and in phone calls that warned a truck to wait outside the gate. The people who bore those costs rarely knew his name. They just knew someone else made the rules, and that arguing often made things worse. He learned early to keep his name out of paper. Orders moved through intermediaries. Conversations happened while walking. People used nicknames and hand gestures more than full sentences. Training instilled habits. Never carry a notebook. Never say a name when a nod will do. Never let a meeting run long enough for a hidden microphone to collect a full thought. Those habits, recalled by cooperators and confirmed in transcripts, created the fog in which he operated. It is why investigators could lay out the shape of his influence with confidence, while still struggling to put his voice at the center of a specific act. It is also why, when a jury finally saw the larger picture, the enterprise charge fit. The crime wasn't a single scene. It was the structure itself. The feud with the Gambino leadership after the 1985 power shift remained a cautionary tale for everyone. The car bombing in 1986, which killed underboss Frank DeCicco, showed how sudden violence could tear through even the most careful plans. Prosecutors later argued that a coalition approved that strike to cool a spotlight. Defense teams, then and later, pushed back at the specifics. The lesson endured regardless of who believed which count. The brighter the glare, the shorter the career. He had trusted that lesson long before that winter, and he stuck to it afterward with even greater resolve. His story also exposed how myths take root. Newspapers liked phrases such as, "boss of bosses," a label the underworld didn't actually use. Real power moved through negotiation, not coronation. The commission, a loose council in earlier years, coordinated policy across families, but no single man wore a crown that could command the entire map. He understood that and built influence through steadiness and restraint rather than title. When agents said he was the Genovese leader, they meant he set direction in that sphere and shaped alliances across the city's underworld. Not that he sat on a throne above all of it. Cultural portrayals have circled his name ever since. Documentaries highlight the bathrobe as a symbol of audacity. Books examine the slow grind of Rico and the prosecutors who spent careers unraveling the trades. Profiles of the village paint him as a ghost moving through a gentrifying neighborhood that barely noticed its own history. Those depictions capture slices of truth. None of them cover every angle. A full accounting requires 2 rooms. One where he murmured a greeting while passing a church, and one where a contractor learned that a delayed pour would cost more than a quiet deal. People who study organized crime often use his life as a case study in adaptation. He started in an era when social clubs felt safe, and when the sound a watch made on a counter could cover a sentence. He lived long enough to see transmitters small enough to hide behind a light switch. He experienced a justice system that learned to treat whispers within a network as one crime rather than as unconnected offenses. He tried to adjust using patience, buffers, and a crafted public weakness. That combination delayed the end, but could not prevent it. The new tools outlasted the old tricks. If you walk past the spot where the Triangle Social Club once stood, you'd see a different kind of room now. Bright bulbs, open windows, people staring at screens. A city that once looked away when a certain man shuffled by now photographs everything. That change makes the old method harder to repeat. It doesn't erase what happened there. It just means memory has to carry more of the weight. The ghosts in those bricks aren't violent. They're procedural. Short sentences, careful nods, a cadence that taught people to say almost nothing and mean quite a lot. The ledger of his life is public. Born in 1928 to immigrant parents. Boxer with a solid record. Driver and aide to powerful men. Tried in 1957 for the Costello shooting, and acquitted when the victim declined to identify the gunman. Convicted in 1,959 inches, a narcotics conspiracy, and sent to federal prison early in adulthood. Rose through the Genovese structure as a soldier, then capo, then leader in the view of prosecutors, and later a jury. Investigated for decades for gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, bid manipulation, and sanctioned violence presented as discipline. Convicted in 1997 on racketeering and related conspiracies. Admitted in 2003 to staging public confusion to obstruct justice and accepted more time. Died in federal custody in 2005. Around those points lived the anecdotes, the rivalries, The daily routines, the acts of kindness, and the acts that took money from people who had little choice. He left behind family who loved him and carried the burden of a famous last name. Some relatives faced charges for their own conduct. Some kept lives far from headlines. Friends, aged into quieter years, moved out of the city or passed on. Agents retired with files that still smelled faintly of the tape adhesive they had used to hide microphones. Lawyers kept transcripts in boxes that now sit in basements and archives. Journalists who had written about him for decades turned to other subjects and occasionally returned to write an anniversary piece about the man who pretended to be lost and nearly convinced a city he was. What remains is a lesson about how power can look dull while it rearranges a place. He didn't rely on a glare to control people. He relied on the fear of disruption in a city that hates delay. He trusted in calendars, lists, and quiet meetings. He respected the pace of institutions and learned how to lean on them. His quiet built a livelihood out of other people's routines. That is why his story lands softly and heavily at once. It doesn't explode. It presses down like a hand that never raises its voice. If you listen to the village at night, the sounds resemble the ones he used as cover. Steam from a pipe, a door closing, a cup on a saucer. On those streets, a boy learned to keep his face plain and his thoughts private. Became a fighter with decent footwork. Grew into a man who mastered the art of saying almost nothing, and then spent years inside rooms where saying almost nothing could earn more than a shout ever would. The same discipline that built his career later built the walls of his final act, the one he admitted in court. The mask that hid him became part of his name. In the end, the mask fell, the sentence stood, and the city carried on. Cities forget and remember in cycles. A plaque goes up, a storefront changes hands, a reporter writes a retrospective, a grandson hears a family story at a table where no one raises a voice. Somewhere, a contractor signs a bid with no hidden surcharge because the rules now require it. Somewhere else, a clerk checks a permit and denies it because a background issue appeared. Those small shifts say as much about his legacy as any headline. They mark boundaries he once blurred, and guardrails put up afterwards so that blurring is harder to do. He taught a generation of associates to treat quiet like armor. He taught a generation of investigators to assume that armor hides something, and to keep digging until the shape emerges. Both lessons survive him. They appear in boardrooms, politics, and any place where incentives push people to hide decisions in routine. His story doesn't excuse that instinct. It warns that it can work for a season, then fail with consequences that echo for years in courtrooms and families. And that was the story of Vincent Gigante, the Oddfather, who walked the streets in silence and shadows, convincing the world he was broken, while quietly pulling the strings of one of the most powerful Mafia families in history. His life was a careful act, a balance of deception and control, that faded only when time itself closed the curtain. Thank you for joining me tonight here at the Silent Empires. Share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories find you. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so you never miss another tale of gangsters and forgotten empires. Sleep peacefully, drift into silence, and good night.